Today we are discussing the new moon occurring in Gemini, and there's a lot of conjunctions happening, which is actually called a stellium because it's 5 planetary bodies. So there's a lot of new information. We haven't discussed Hades or Kronos in much detail before, and also the fixed star Sirius. I have chaptered the blog today so you can pause or skip through and get the information that you want. I look forward to getting your feedback. Share in the comments what your big takeaway was. Let's watch it. Welcome to Star Kittens Media. Today we are discussing the new moon occurring on July 6 at 10:57 a.m. New Zealand time, which is the day before in the United States on the East Coast at 6:57 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I am, of course, joined by David. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Hello.
Are you excited about all this Gemini energy?
I am excited about that and the conjunctions to Kronos and Hades, which I don't know whether we've spoken of them before. So yeah, super excited about this one.
And as we were talking about this and we were listening to something else, there are certain people that have a really negative connotation towards certain planetary bodies or certain astrological signs and really happy, positive, associations with other ones. For example, here in the West, and a lot of 12-sign astrologers are all talking about Gemini as the quick-witted, the funny, the party goer. But in the Eastern side, there's actually quite a different nuance to that whole thing. And also Saturn, we've never really portrayed Saturn as that angry father that a lot of people associate Saturn with. So I think today's discussion will hopefully enlighten people that there are no bad energies. All things within astrology have their own story to tell. And I think by understanding each archetype, we can enrich our own life and just understand it a little bit better. So you've mentioned Kronos, Hades, Gemini. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, I guess the overall theme here is with any new moon is that, of course, it's the beginning of a 28-day lunar cycle. So naturally, that is a time to set intentions and to follow up those intentions with some decisive action. But as a theme, if I was to summarize this with the Gemini and the Saturnian influence, would be that the student and the teacher. That's kind of the idea here, and we will get into how I've arrived at that idea of the student and the teacher, but we'll put that out there for now. Of course, the Kronos influence with the new moon is conjunct to Kronos, Hades, and the star Sirius. So there's a lot going on. There's actually a 5-way conjunction, which in astrology is called a stellium, and it has it packs a lot of punch, if you like. So the concept of Kronos, or the archetype of Kronos, is absolutely to do with leadership and governance. Hades has to do with the idea of the life cycle, and we will touch on that. And the star Sirius has a role in the pathway or process of how we become enlightened, if you like, which really is a state of awareness that I guess we're all striving for eventually at somewhere along the line. Gemini, in simple terms, represents how we learn or learned, but particularly in our childhood, how we analyze and interpret reality. And Saturn, of course, represents mastery and discipline, wisdom and resilience that develops over time. Saturn cycles, of course, are between 28 and 30 years. So effectively 3 decades is Saturn's cycle, whereas Gemini spins very quickly. So it's quite a fleeting experience. So you've got this really strong energy of Saturn, which is very slow moving and methodical. And you've got this very quick energy. And you mentioned that at the beginning. So those two paradoxes, if you like, are at play here. And Saturn is reminding us to prepare ourselves to transition to the next phase, experience, or dimension eventually as the physical form passes away, that we believe that we are spirit beings having a physical human experience. And Saturn is the reminder that at the end of that process, whenever it is, we pass through, we phase through into a different dimension of spirit. We leave behind the reality of the physical world and we move to the spirit world, which is where we came from originally. So a lot going on, and looking forward to moving into discussing some of these aspects in a bit more depth.
Yes. So new moon, as you say, new beginning, new cycle. Gemini is ruled by Mercury. So tell us, what does the Gemini energy, how do you see that play out right now?
So to be clear, Mercury has no role in this reading. So we're talking about Mercury's home sign, of course, of Gemini. And you mentioned right at the beginning that there is a view in the west of Gemini, and there's a less understood, certainly for us that are in the Western Hemisphere listening to this, but those from elsewhere will get that Gemini has a very different paradigm, if you like, or perspective in the East. And by that, I mean in some of the older traditions, including in the Middle East as well. But Gemini in the West is really associated. I think most people understand the 2 pillars, and the sign of Gemini is a lot of people are excited when they know or find out that they're a Gemini sun or a Gemini rising, because it is associated with frivolity and fun. And you mentioned quick-wittedness, communication. Gemini in astrology is the archetype of the left brain. It's that critical thinking part of us, is where we collect data, and we develop our minds. And of course, the 2 pillars, the sign for Gemini, is to do with the twins, and the duality and the polarity of the 2 sides. Be that concepts like black and white, right and wrong, good and bad, love, hate, hot, cold, and so on and so forth, that we learn as kids. That's one of the ways that we grasp reality, is that duality and that polarity. So Gemini is absolutely to do with our mental constructs and ideas, our filters of life, and how our biases, our preferences and our desires, again, rooted in childhood, that may be manifesting through into our adult life and beyond even. Gemini is the repository of memory. This is where all our experiences are processed through the mercurial mind. Reality starts and finishes with what we see, smell, taste, touch, and hear. The 5 senses are, of course, all processed through the mind of Mercury, or as a metaphor, the mercurial mind, as I mentioned. Therefore, Mercury does have some limitations, and we can, because of those memories, because of distorted experiences, because we see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear. Mercury also, on its shadow side, can be about delusions and self-deceptions and distortions in our thinking. And Gemini, of course, and we see this with the kids, is that these relationships that we develop as children with our siblings, with our parents, with our influences, And even these days with celebrities and role models that are coming through the digital world, that is very much in that Gemini energy, especially for kids. Gemini is where we can feel mental pressure and the verbal linguistic default settings. So sometimes when we're under pressure mentally, we can spout off, if you like, or get very limited in the way that we communicate. So these are kind of the shadow sides or the other aspects of Gemini that a lot of people don't talk about, but of course exist. Gemini is where we get our grasp of words. It's where we learn to identify and describe and label experiences. And, Gemini is about, what do I know about? What is my skill set? What are my childhood recollections? What knowledge do I have? And Gemini can be difficult, therefore, because often we can overload our brain, we can overload our mental processes, and Gemini can be associated with being literally brain dead, overwhelmed, overloaded. And the expression I like is that we have limited bandwidth, because it's effectively a mental processing machine that's there in our left brain. And sometimes under Gemini, we can redline. So we can over talk, we can overthink, we can overanalyze. So those themes, all of that is to do with a moon and a sun conjunct in Gemini. All of those things come to the surface.
That's just great because, as you know, my moon is in Gemini and it's actually really close to where the new moon is going to occur because the fixed star Sirius, which we will talk about later, is conjunct my natal moon. So paralysis by analysis is definitely something that I'm very familiar with, but I also love that by understanding Gemini more and more and looking at its strengths is to not dwell in the emotion as we all go through life and things might not go the way we want it to go, rather than it really sitting into my body or getting really down by it. The strength of my Gemini moon is then to quickly think about it and move on. I'm still learning to do that. But as I said, every energy that is in the astrological mosaic of life has got strengths that we can draw on. And I think by then really understanding where the true position is of your natal chart can give you so many more insights, because the sun is definitely in Gemini now. Look, use your star app and you will see that the sun is definitely in Gemini. So the first or the second thing that we'll talk about, but the first new thing we're talking about today is Kronos. And people have not really heard us talk about that. So please give us a little bit of background and then how it ties into this new moon at the moment.
Kronos, spelt with a K, that's Kronos. Really interesting. So Kronos is, we like to talk about the mythology and the what is out there in the common understanding of, usually the mythology that we are drawing on as astrologers is to do with either the Greek or Roman ideas or concepts that were formed about some of these archetypes. And certainly Kronos falls into that bucket. Kronos broadly is the archetype of leadership and governance, but to understand a little bit about that, it pays to, and it's helpful to, for context, to have a look at the Greek myth, the Greek tragedy of Kronos. So I will touch on that and then we'll unfold it from there. Kronos, again, like any of these myths and these stories, whether it's from indigenous cultures, whether it's from the Greek, the Roman, whether it's from farther east, it doesn't matter. They're not literal, but they are designed to help us understand human concepts through these kind of metaphysical ideas. So in Greek mythology, Kronos was identified or known as the king of the Titans, and he was the son of Gaia, the earth mother, and Uranus, the sky father. Uranus himself feared, as is typical in dynasties, as the story is told, he feared usurpation. He feared being overtaken by his kids. So he went out of his way in this Greek tragedy to suppress and repress and subjugate his children. This is Uranus, the sky father, Kronos' dad. And Kronos, as one of the sons kids, decided that he'd had enough of this. So he rose up and overthrew Uranus. And this is where, in astrology, Kronos, of course, is the Greek name for Saturn. And Saturn, of course, is the Roman. So we're talking about two sides of the coin, if you like. Kronos, Saturn are not the same because they come from different mythologies, but they are effectively talking about some of the story of Saturn and the story of Kronos are quite similar. So Kronos rose up, overthrew his dad, and this is where the idea of Capricorn, of course, Kronos, Saturn is linked to Capricorn, and Aquarius, Uranus are linked as well. This is where the idea of the conflict between the Uranian world of innovation and progression, represented by this desire of Kronos to evolve the patriarchal system, and Capricorn, a form of stability and keeping things as they are. So we see playing out in astrology regularly this sort of tension between Capricorn, the way things are, and Aquarius, the way things can be. So that's a kind of a big picture view of the moral of the story of Kronos rising up and upsetting the apple cart, if you like. But Kronos himself inherited some of that intersenine, that family fear around being overtaken. So he, as the mythology goes, his own children, his own dynasty, he consumed his children. And Gaia, as of course the mother, seeing this happen and wanting to break the cycle, took one of the kids, whose name was Zeus, also known as Jupiter, and he was ushered away. So he didn't, in the end, get consumed by Kronos. And this is an interesting part of the story. So Zeus was kept away from Kronos by Gaia, the mother. And when old enough, Kronos was drugged by Zeus, and this forced Kronos to expel the kids. So they came back into reality. And all of the kids eventually, just as Kronos had done to Uranus, they banded together and they overthrew Kronos and cast him into Hades, which is what we're going to talk about shortly. Of course, Hades representing the pit. So the moral of the story is about the struggle for self-determination and the battle with tyranny. And we'll go into that in a little bit deeper in a moment. The governance, so our ideas of governance and rulers or overlords, and what do we do about that? And these are themes or scenarios that first emerge in our childhood. Everyone deals with this because as a child, we are subject to either the authority or the lording over, in some cases, of parents or siblings, teachers or guardians, as well-meaning as they may be. We see this particularly playing out in very strong cultural heritages where, the kids are to behave in a certain way and the parents are the authority just by virtue or by dint of the fact that they were born into that family. They are immediately subjugated. So all of these ideas of our relationship with authority is tied up in this Kronos archetype and the Kronos themes, and they emerge in childhood, which, as we've just mentioned before, is where Gemini comes in, because Gemini, of course, in the astrological mosaic, the astrological system, is where all of these memories of both current timeline and past lives are dealing with this issue of how we deal with rulers and authority figures, and the idea of really empowerment versus disempowerment, and the mindset that we develop about authority figures is really resting in our Gemini childhood experiences. So it's very interesting that we have a new moon conjunct with Gemini and Kronos, because it's bringing these ideas to the surface.
So much there, and it's such a I think it is a privilege to be a parent. I know that it's not for everyone, but they really are our greatest teachers, and it is. I feel very grateful to have conversations about, okay, so their behavior is this now. Is this how you want them to be in the future? Because it is all about those first 7 to 10 years. How do they perceive the world? Do they have a safe space to be in? Are they being taught to communicate? You know, for me, it is such a normal thing to read books to my children. But unfortunately, a lot of children don't get that because life is too busy for their parent. And that is just a very simple explanation for me about Gemini. It's the words we use. And I think by giving children a vast array of words, whether it's in one language or multiple, you give them so many more tools to truly understand their emotions, but also being able to communicate. And it's that communication, because we still can't properly use telepathy to communicate with our loved ones. So we really have to use the words. And if we don't know a word, we get frustrated. And then by being frustrated, that can have all sorts of consequences from the day it happens all the way until we die. Because if we can't properly express the way we feel, it can get stuck in our physical body as well as our emotional and spiritual body. So thank you so much for really deep diving into Kronos and the different mythologies behind it. I find that so fascinating and so true that it really helps us understand human behavior. It is such a beautiful tool for that. So you've already mentioned Hades, the pit. So please tell us more about Hades and who that relates to, or that might be more well known.
Yeah, and just before I touch on that, just again building on what you've just said, is that, you know, kids learn about authority from, it isn't necessarily the parents. You know, these days it could be that they're learning about authority figures, they're learning about how to interact with, this is the Kronos archetype, how to interact with, you know, rulers, perceived rulers. You know, it might be the father of the house or the mother of the house, or it might be the big brother or the big sister. We learn all of that in that Gemini period of childhood. And I mean, these two things are so inextricably linked. So building on that, of course, Hades, which is very interesting. There's, again, Hades, the Greek mythology, and Pluto being the Roman version of this. Again, they're slightly different, but also juxtaposed and come across each other. Of course, this battle that was going on in the Kronos lineage, you know, starting with Gaia and Uranus to Kronos and Zeus and so on and so forth, that is weaved so much through astrology. One of those kids was Poseidon, or Pisces, the lord or deity of the sea, and that includes the sea of consciousness. Another of those kids was Chiron, and we talked about the asteroid Chiron last time. So there's a lot going on there. And the role of Hades is so interesting. If you just cast your mind back briefly to where did they cast the father? They cast, so these are Kronos' kids, they cast him into Hades. So Hades is both a literal and a metaphorical, has literal and metaphorical meaning. Hades, ruler of the underworld. The tie back to Gemini and the Eastern view of Gemini is that those pillars represent the dimensional doorway to this underworld. And Mercury, as the ruler of Gemini in Eastern mythology, was the winged messenger who was able to move between the two dimensions of life and the underworld. What many would call maybe the third and fourth dimensional planes. Mercury was the winged messenger who was one of the only deities that was able to go down into these depths and also come and emerge back out, sort of unscathed. So that Gemini-Mercury relationship is very interesting when it comes to Hades. Of course, in a archetypal or symbol, just getting my words a bit tongue-tied there, Hades symbolizes the mental and emotional barriers that we have to trauma, the karmic loops, the regrets and fears that we have. It is a human tendency, and we all do it, to recoil from difficult situations. And in the context of this Gemini energy, and we're building up to this idea that Gemini is where we first grasped our ideas, where we learned either from others, we learned from tough experiences, we learned from siblings, we learned from the television, we learned from media, whatever those sources of information are. Not all of it was good. And some of it was difficult, and some of it was we've pushed away, and we all do this. And so we have blind spots, we have aspects of our nature that many would call the shadow aspects, that we just do not want to confront. But the reality is that this is where Hades comes in. From a positive perspective, Hades is the place where all of that goes. So we want to push it out of our conscious mind and put it into the underworld. So that's the archetype of Hades. This is where that trauma sits. And this can be not only in this timeline, it can be from other timelines, because the soul's memories of past experiences also sit in the repository or the archetype of Hades. So this is where we are, it's a point in the chart where we are reluctant to look back, where we're resistant to change, where we can be angry, we can be lost, we can be dazed and confused. Hades symbolizes also the life, death, rebirth, never-ending cycle. And in the Vedic tradition, Hades manifests through the idea of the three states of being, which is creation, Brahma, Vishnu, maintenance, and Shiva, destruction. So we see again that idea of this Hades process of life and death intermingling. In the law of thermodynamics, we again see this idea of this underworld and this overworld. Energy never dissipates, it just simply changes form. We see it in the lemniscate, the figure eight, the infinity symbol. Those who love tarot, or those who, it's everywhere. The idea of the figure eight, the infinity symbol, is that, there's life and that there's death. And so Hades is not to be feared. The Egyptian iconography of the Ouroboros and the snake eating its tail is another manifestation of the Hades kind of energy coming through. So it's everywhere. And of course, Hades, or hell, in the Western, mythological and spiritual texts, the Bible talks very much about being cast into the pit of hell. So Hades, hell, are interchangeable. Hades is that life after death experience. It's where the material passes away, where our physical bodies is bound to time manifest in Gemini, because Gemini is left brain and therefore time. this is where the material passes away. And it is therefore part of the path to enlightenment is to understand that death is just an illusion. It's a gateway, and it's where the physical only passes away and where we are released back into spirit. So therefore it has a positive place and a positive role as an archetype to play in our understanding of astrology and the life, death, and rebirth process.
We need death to create life. It's part of it, and it is winter now here in New Zealand, and we have these beautiful fungus balls that look like a soccer ball, just the spine of it. And for me, it is new life that has appeared because the conditions were just so. They were just right for a new, beautiful, complicated structure to come, and it will disappear again. And that is life for me. And we might notice the big things of the blossom in spring and the leaves dropping in autumn, but it is all around us all the time throughout the year. The next one, which you and I have spoken about lots of times, but I'm not sure we've really spoken about it in the blogs, is the fixed star Sirius. And again, this is one of those contentious stars used in astrology. Some people are like, oh no, that's a bad energy, or yes, that's a great energy. It is an energy, and let's use it to our benefit. So what is your take on the fixed star Sirius?
Well, any time there's contention, I love doing a deep dive, because there's always two sides, and sometimes more than two sides to a story. And there's narratives, and there's all kinds of things coming through, which of course is part of that's Gemini. If Gemini is the archetype of modern day, both personal and broadcast communication or media, then very much the distortions, and we hear all about mis and disinformation and so on and so forth. So when, and I've talked about this before, when I first began my astrological journey, I mean, I was maybe 9 or 10, and I was using it to understand, or try to understand, more about life. And I found over the course of 40 years plus, and I think that in fact it's so intuitive to me that I think that actually I was doing this on other timelines as well. So the star Sirius is one that I love to talk about, but we just often don't get the opportunity. But certainly at this new moon, absolutely. So this is my understanding, the good, the bad, and the ugly about Sirius. It's historically, Sirius was the star that appeared, because it's a fixed star, you don't always see it. So depending on where you are on the Earth, and depending on which season it is, and which hemisphere you're in, Sirius will appear sometimes and other times will not. So Sirius as a star appeared this is in the Egyptian history, as it is told anyway, that when it appeared, and it's very bright, it is one of the brightest objects in the night sky, or in the morning sky as well. There are Venus can be incredibly bright, as can Mercury, but Sirius is certainly extremely prominent. And again, you mentioned about the star apps. If you're using star apps, and you can find Sirius, and you'll see just how bright this planetary body is. So when it appeared for the Egyptians, it signaled that the river Nile would be refilled, and that flooding and would happen, and that it was a rebirth after a hot, dry season. So therefore, Sirius came to be associated in the Egyptian mythology with flooding and regeneration, and the changing of the seasons. And he or it was linked, therefore, or correlated to, or associated with abundance. the good graces and the benevolence of the gods. Oh my goodness, after a hot, dry summer, we're finally going to get some water and some rain, and we're going to be able to, you know, make hay while the sun shines, sort of thing. And the green, everything changes, of course, with water, the colors and the crops and so on and so forth. So Sirius had a really positive historical reference, of course, for the Egyptians. However, this is where some of the distortions come in, and we look at the Kabbalah view of Sirius and the construction of the tree of life and the 10 Sephiro, and those that are familiar with that will just look it up on the internet. You will see the dot, which is the DA apostrophe AT, which is the one of the Sephiro, is right in the middle of the Kabbalah tree of life. And in many versions of that particular story, or that mythological framework, spiritual framework, the dot or Sirius is related to the mystical state of quintessence. That is the point at which an adept who's following the Kabbalah process, which is an evolutionary process, which is an ascension process, that is the point at which they become or experience quintessence. They experience omniscience. They become one with source. In other words, they return back to, following having gone through an incredible journey, they become one with source, and therefore they know all, and everything is known at that point. Therefore, in the Kabbalah and some of the darker references and texts, the occultic texts, the Luciferian texts, Sirius is linked to what's called the morning star, which symbolizes, in that the darker religions, it symbolizes enlightenment. But then you got again another version of it, and there are very prominent speakers out there and authors for years and years and years have been channeling what they call the Syrian High Council, just as there are many out there who bring through the Pleiadians. There are many out there who bring through the Arcturians. There are plenty of channels that bring through the Syrian energy. And, you know, Paddy Corey is one of those. Lisa Renee is another. And of course, Kaya Ra talks about the Sophia Code, and has the very strong links back to the Sirius Egyptian mythology, which those three, Paddy Corey, Lisa Renee, Kaya Ra, all bring all associate, if you like, that Syrian energy. Again, it's the enlightenment energy, but they associate it with the Christos, spelt with a K-R-I-S-T-O-S, the Christos vibration. And that is one of the reasons why it's been messed with on the occult side. The Syrians, and to be clear, Lisa Renee distinguishes between Sirius A and Sirius B. One part of Sirius has been corrupted by the same dark entities and forces that have corrupted many planets, including our own. And one part of it has been free of that. So the Syrian energy, the positive, the most elevated side of the Syrian energy, and therefore the star Sirius, is the archetype and vector for that energy, is that these beings, these Syrian beings, are keepers of ancient knowledge. They are the ones who oversee the mystery schools. And that's one of the reasons that they're being co-opted and corrupted by the order. And so with all of that, there's three kind of views of it. I leave it to you, the listeners and the watchers, and you decide for yourself. Is it dark? Is it light? Or is it somewhere in between?
Yes, use your Gemini mind to ponder on that one.
Absolutely.
So the new moon makes a trine with our friend Saturn, and Saturn is still sitting in Aquarius. So a trine is a positive relationship. So take it away.
Yeah, Saturn And we've said all through the blog today, and it is our position that there is, as we've just talked about with Sirius, there's good, there's bad, there's light, there's dark, there's positive and affirming, and there's negative and disempowering aspects to all of these stories and archetypes. And certainly Saturn falls into that boat. And I think part of that is to do with the tarot card, which is very often associated with Saturn, which is the devil card. And, there's so much in that card. There is so much going on in that card. So anytime Saturn's involved, either through a trine, which is, as you said, is a free flowing, it's easy to access the lessons and the energies of Saturn at this time. So what we're really talking about here in the context of a full moon conjunct to Kronos, conjunct to the star Sirius, and conjunct to Hades, in a beautiful trine with Saturn, is that this new moon, this particular moon, is an opportunity to reset, to ponder, to contemplate, to review, to consider, to look back at the past, to look at the present, and to look to the future. That's the Aquarius energy. Saturn, as you mentioned, in the true zodiac, is sitting in Aquarius. He's not in Pisces, where the 12 signers have Saturn. Saturn's not there. So the past, present, and future. Look back, look at the present, look at the future, and consider the lessons that you've learned. And you can be any age. It doesn't matter. If you can think, you can reflect, and then this is for you. What's coming to light right now? And through wisdom and hindsight. Some people say, oh, they're kind of skeptical and say, oh, but that's just wisdom and hindsight. But in fact, that's the positive side of Saturn, is that sometimes we can only get wisdom and hindsight. Sometimes we have to go through some stuff in order to learn from it. Sometimes we have to get burned. We were talking about that the other day when I was reflecting on a childhood experience of pulling a jug off. I was 5 or 6 or 4 or whatever, and pulling a hot boiling jug off the bench. You learn lessons, and sometimes they're harsh lessons. But that's just how it is. But Saturn reminds us to dig into our mercurial mind, to dig into our memories, and to bring forward some of the positive mantras. One of the ones that I've always had, and I learned as a kid, was everything you do multiplies and comes back to you. Everything you do multiplies and comes back to you. That's a Saturn lesson right there. And that's in my memory, and that's something I learned from childhood, which is a classic example of the merge between the Gemini energy and the Saturnian energy. What mantras have you memorized? What memories do you have that can serve you and help you to evolve? This is the positive aspect. Saturn reminds us that we have a path, that we have a purpose, and that life is not simply a random collection of events. And Saturn brings a deeper meaning that behind why on earth are we here? And what are we doing as humans? And I mentioned in the beginning, it's one of our favorite expressions, is that we are spirit having a human experience. And where are we going? As a species and individually? Saturn holds us accountable in the astrological mosaic. His role, his energy, is to hold us accountable through the tough lessons. And in this context, with the Kronos energy, Saturn will manifest through tensions and struggles with authority figures. And that could be a battle with your mum, your dad, or it could be a battle with the tax department. Saturn asks us to be responsible for our actions, to be self-directed, to be strong and resolute. And he marks time. He ticks off those key cycles of 7, 14, 21, 28. The cycles of 7 are very prominent in life. He ticks off those cycles of 9. There's a lot of these sort of cycles are moving through our lives, what we call the rites of passage. Saturn marks those transitions from phase to phase, or from the Vedic perspective that we talked about before, where life gives way to maintenance, gives way to destruction, gives way to life, and that endless infinity cycle. Saturn reminds us that our memory, however, is often just a story. And this is the Gemini relationship, is that, yep, sure, all our memories are there. We might not be able to quickly bring them back. And sometimes we have to do some regression techniques and some tapping and different modalities to bring that memory back. But at the same time, some of those memories are just stories that we told ourselves, and they're not real. So Saturn says, hey, take a look back and figure out where you might be rationalizing your behavior based on a childhood experience. You might be justifying digging in or being a particular way, and maybe it's time to review that in the light of consciousness. And facts and fiction can be a little blurry under Gemini, so that can be subjective and unhelpful. But Saturn says, actually, lay it all out, take a look at it, break it down, take what works and leave behind the rest. And finally, Saturn is about focusing on our legacy. I mentioned before, and it's common knowledge, that Saturn cycles effectively roughly between 28 and 30 years. So these are 3 decades. And for most of us, we'll get 3 cycles of Saturn in our lives, 30, 60, 90. So therefore, Saturn is about legacy and mastery at each of those junctures, particularly around 28 to 30, 58 to 60, 88 to 90. And finally, the settlement of karmic debts. And that is possible, but that's possible only through conscious trawling, if you like, back through those mercurial memories, which, as I said, some of the ways that we act in life, based on what we learned as kids, sometimes from authority figures or from experiences, although they were well-meaning, although they meant something at the time, maybe now Saturn says, hey, maybe that just needs to be reviewed, reconfigured, and maybe thrown out as well.
Yeah, forgiveness is what comes to me as we go through the review of our life. You might look back and go on, oh, my sibling had a much better childhood because I'm the oldest and I had to endure everything. Your parents, no, I'll put this as a question. How about you look at it in a way of, my parents did the best that they could at that time, and you forgive them for whatever heartache or whatever you feel they did to you. It has made you the person you are today. And extending that olive branch is not only releasing them, but it's also will give you more freedom. And I think by forgiveness, we can then truly shine more and more in our authentic being, and the world would be a much better place. Thank you so much for all that beautiful energies, explanation of the energies today. Some new ones, Kronos, Sirius, Hades. How would you like to sum it up?
Yeah, again, just bridging from what you've just talked about there with the parental, for many of us, our Kronos parental kind of experiences are all sort of linked. And there are, one of my favorite, and I've watched it maybe 2 or 3 times, but one of my favorite TV programs is that Succession, because it really, that captures this whole idea of, what did we learn as kids and what legacy? So you kind of got the 2 sides of this wrapped up in Saturn being the legacy and the mastery, and what did we learn after 30, 60, and 90 years, and what are we here to pass on? And the kids coming through, making those own decisions and saying, well, actually, some of what I learned along the way, it doesn't work anymore. And that's that kind of Aquarian innovation desire to almost sometimes disrupt the status quo. So that's absolutely part of the summary. But if I was to sort of go back a little bit and say, where did we start? We started with Gemini, and actually what we're talking about there is Gemini is that childhood. It's those learned experiences that you mentioned 7 to 10. Well, that's when our thinking brain really starts to kick in, probably a little earlier than that. But, Gemini is all of that. And let's call it 0 to 10. And, so Gemini is the childhood learned, developed concepts of life. And they are just sitting there. And therefore, it's a repository of information, and some of it's helpful and some of it's, frankly, unhelpful. But Saturn asks us, and this is the theme of this new moon, is review it and reframe those experiences if you choose to do so. And Kronos is about our default settings around authority, about our relationship with role models and rulers and governors, or those who we perceive have power over us, and that we are in that Gemini polarity of power under, and therefore someone has power over, which ultimately is actually about disempowerment and empowerment. And those are themes coming out in the home, coming out in the schools, coming out in the fights between unions and governments. It's coming out in corporations. It's coming out in the religious circles. It's everywhere. That whole idea of usurpation and disrupting the existing rule is Kronos energy, and that is manifesting on a personal and collective level. Anywhere you look, you'll see that happening. So Kronos, Gemini, Saturn energy here is about, will we be self-determined? Where and how are we being subjugated by our memories? Firstly, because their memories are manifesting in our reality. Hades asks us to be open, therefore, to emotional healing and to be willing to rehabilitate our trauma. Sirius holds the promise and potential of a life well lived. Sirius is the process of awareness and awakening through disciplined thought and practice. And Saturn holds us accountable. I've talked about the 30, 60, 90, but it's also cycles within cycles, the 7 cycles and the 9 cycles particularly. Saturn governs those phase transitions in our life. But as I mentioned before, one of my favorite mantras, of course, every action has a reaction. Everything we think or say and do multiplies and comes right back to you as a ripple effect. And Saturn's saying, hey, hang on, everything you think, everything you say, everything you do was probably related to childhood. So just consider that it's waving out and it will come back. The Gemini new moon trines Saturn. The student is ready. The teacher appears. That teacher is you and your higher self. And that higher self is the part of us that draws on the wisdom, experience, and knowledge that we've gathered in this timeline and in past timelines, if that's what you want to believe. And this is our opportunity as a wrap up to survive, not just survive, but thrive. And all of these energies collectively, whether it's Gemini energy, the sun and moon, together at a start of a new 28-day lunar cycle, the trine to Saturn, the conjunction to Kronos and Hades and Sirius. Wow, there's a lot going on.
There is a lot going on, and there's a lot of new energy explanations that you've given us. So thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please check out the other videos we have here on YouTube, or if you're listening on Spotify, we have most of our recent podcasts or blogs on there as well. You can find us on Telegram, Instagram, Facebook. You can get your own natal chart or go all out and get a 2-hour reading with us. It is life-changing. We don't just discuss the position of the big planetary bodies, but also the relationships they have with one another. So get in touch with us. Share in the comments what your big takeaway is, and we shall see you again at the full moon. Thank you so much.
Namaste.
Namaste.